we have got a short period of time to canter through what we know about how to prepare for Ofgem's heat network performance reporting requirements. So let me tell you a little about who I am and where I work. So I'm Casey Cole. I'm the CEO of Guru Systems. If you click on the next slide there, thank you. We provide hardware and software as a service, mainly to heating and cooling networks across the UK. We are focused on making those heating and cooling networks more transparent, lower cost, and lower carbon, mainly through enabling the data to flow, energy performance data to flow out of those systems. That data gets used for, it also gets used for things like billing, but it's used to assess the performance of heating and cooling networks and then enable them to be improved. We've been at this for about 11 years. We are installed or being installed on about 45,000 dwellings across the UK. And when using our data, operators have cut their heat losses by as much as 70%. That's pretty standard. We've got our products laid out across the bottom there, but I'm not going to go into that in detail because I don't think we've got time for that bit. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about performance management tools later, but that's later. So next slide, please. Right. Ofgem is coming in as the regulator of heat and cooling networks. Ofgem's job up until now, the clue's in their name, has been for gas and electricity networks. And they're now going to be covering heating and cooling on top of that. The way that has been structured is laid out on this slide here. And this slide is one of Ofgem's slides, right? So they talk about the basis on which you will operate a heat network. Will you be authorized? Will you be licensed? License being a much deeper option than just authorization. There will be a digital platform, more on which later, because that's a really crucial ingredient on how this is all going to work. And then they describe themselves this breaking down into different chunks, the regulation, right? So we've got monitoring and reporting, consumer protection, pricing, metering, billing, technical standards, so largely the heat network technical assurance scheme, and decarbonization. And then if stuff happens, they take action. There's a really important point to make here, and that is around the digitalization. If you're Ofgem and you've just been assigned this role of looking after heat networks, you got to decide how you're going to do it. When Ofgem, if they look at their existing portfolio, they've got a limited number of for example, electricity distribution network operators and gas shippers, like 14 DNOs, right? 6 gas shippers, I think it is. If you're Ofgem and you want to talk to the people that you're regulating, you can probably get them all in a room. You could certainly ring them up in a day if you needed to talk to them all, right? But now here comes the heat network space, and the official estimate is 14,000 heat network operators, and we know it's more than that, right? Because those are just the ones that are known about, and we know that there's a big parts of the market that are not known officially. So you're going from 14 DNOs, for example, to 14,000 heat networks. How are you going to do that? You're going to do that by digitalizing. You're going to be doing that by, as much as possible, automating the process of assessing how the folks that you're regulating are doing against the regulation. And you're going to be sparing in how you apply human eyeballs onto that, right? And that's where digitalization comes in. So this principle of you're going to be collecting data for Ofgem. You're going to be making a submission of that data, either manually or automatically, through a digital platform. And it's very, very likely that the Ofgem systems are then going to be assessing that data as it comes through their platform to catch the ones that appear to be outside the whatever the acceptable parameters are. And then human eyeballs will get applied, right? So this idea of you want to be submitting data that demonstrates compliance is crucial, because then you carry on doing your job as an operator. But if you're submitting data that demonstrates that your network isn't doing what it's meant to do, well, then you're caught, and then the human eyeballs get applied. So this idea about digitalization and digital platform is fundamental to the way that Ofgem is going to have to regulate this space. Next slide, please. I feel like Chris Whitty every time I say that. Okay, so what's going to get covered? Mostly everything, although it might get covered in slightly different ways, right? So let's start, actually, paradoxically, let's start on the far right of this slide. New networks are going to be caught, no surprise there, including ambient loop, right? So including these systems where you've got some source of heat in a plant room, distributing it at quite low temperature, 25 to 35 degrees, and then dwelling level heat pumps that are upgrading the temperature of that water and delivering the higher temperature to the dwelling. Those are caught too. And that's crucial. So now I'm going to go over to the left. The existing networks with meters installed, right? So we see a lot of those post the 2014 regs. So it's likely that all of those will be caught. Now, right, when I say likely, what I mean is what we have to go on in the public domain are the things that Ofgem have said, that DESNZ have said, that they're the folks that they have contracted out certain pieces of scheme development, what they have said. So, for example, the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme is being delivered by GemServe and Fair Heat. They presented on stuff. So there's enough information that's flowing out for us to form a pretty good idea of what direction this is going. Existing networks with meters installed, yep. And existing networks without meters installed will also be caught. So we've got upcoming stuff and we've got the existing networks. We cannot leave behind the existing networks. They have to be brought up to some standard. Now, that might be a different standard, but it still has to be a minimum level of compliance. The window over which operators will be able to improve their network, like what kind of grace period do they get to get things up to a standard? Well, I think that's something we don't have clarity on yet. We don't know how long that window is going to be, but we do have a really good idea that regardless of how long they might have to bring existing networks up to a standard, the data is going to have to flow. Or the first job is baseline it, understand exactly what's going on there, collect this data, probably submit this data, and Ofgem, although they might not enforce against those minimum standards in the early days, it's coming and you have to have visibility. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is this is the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme that I talked about a minute ago. This corresponds to the technical standards from that previous slide that Ofgem are applying. We know that when you measure outcomes, then against a standard or against a quantified requirement, you get better results. Right? If you're just saying, yeah, we promise we will commission to a certain standard, you sign something saying that, we just see those schemes go in all sorts of directions. But where you test, where you gather data against a quantified requirement and prove the outcome, those schemes are great. And that principle of measure and demonstrate against a quantified target is baked into the technical assurance scheme. This has got, this slide here shows that it sort of follows the project lifecycle, or the lifecycle of a network, all the way from concept design all the way through O&M. There's another way that it is divided up, and it's divided up into the chunks of a network. So, and these chunks will probably be certified separately. They will have different data reporting requirements. So an energy center, transmission pipe work, large heat exchangers, for example, distribution within a block, the HIUs, and then the tertiary systems inside the dwelling. Each of these is a separate chunk that will almost certainly have a separate certification and its own reporting requirements. The exact KPIs, as you'll see in a sec, the exact KPIs are not clear yet. They haven't been published, but we have a reasonable idea of what direction they're headed by looking at what else is out there. Super, thank you. So we're going to home in a little bit on operation and maintenance. So what do we know? Well, we think that the reporting requirements are going to be annual. There's been some discussion about whether some reporting requirements might be more frequent than that. One of the models that's been used or been drawn on by Ofgem is the heat trust model, and heat trust would publish data annually, for example. So it's not going to be less frequent than annual. The reporting will be via that digital platform. Ofgem has been exploring exactly how that might work. We are hoping that in the interest of interoperability and the ability of lots of folks to use whatever systems they want to use, that Ofgem is going to publish an API, so a way of computers to talk to computers, servers to talk to servers, that's documented and clear for everybody. But we'll see which way we go. I think the first go in this area was web forms, which are fine for a start, but don't get you to scale. So that's the sort of, that's my personal impression of the direction that I think things will have to head in. The data that's going to be used for this is drawn from the same data set that you, as if you're not an actual heat network operator on this call, imagine you are accumulating a data set, and then you need to use that data set to do your job, and your job might involve interfacing to different stakeholders. One of them could be your metering and billing operator, and they need a certain set of data. Another might be the planning authority. Imagine that you're in Ealing, or well, pretty much anywhere in Greater London, and you've got reporting requirements to the GLA for be seen. And now here comes Ofgem. They are another stakeholder that's going to need this data. But investors, right? For ESG, you may have your own internal KPIs. It's not just about reporting. As I'm going to show you in just a second, it's also about how you use that data in order to ensure that your systems are working well. But it's crucial to kind of get across this idea that there is a data set that you need in order to do your job. You've got different stakeholders who have different requirements of you using that data. Ofgem is going to be another one of these. So this is a way of thinking about it, that it's not going from, it's not going from your systems to one of your stakeholders who's then going to hand it off to another stakeholders. It's not linear. This is a hub and spoke sort of setup, because that data, or at least cuts of that data, not exactly the same data set, is going to be required by different stakeholders in different forms. Okay. Right. So how do we get it right on the road to regulation? Q1 2025 is just shockingly close. It's just so close. So it's not, originally that sounded like a long way off. And originally, I don't know if you recall, but the expectation was that Ofgem was going to start regulating 2024 originally, and then it was going the Q1 2025. That timeframe has stuck, and it has stuck consistently over a period of time while the regulations have been worked on, that I think we can actually say, yeah, that's when it's coming. But boy, it's sooner than it originally felt. You need to be collecting data before you have to submit it to Ofgem. And this comes back to that point I was making earlier about digitalization, the automation of kind of filtering out the data that's submitted via the digital platform at Ofgem. You need to be submitting data that shows that your systems are compliant. And that means that you need to be looking at the performance issues on your networks. Okay, on your existing networks, maybe there's a window where there's going to be a grace period and they don't have to be perfect on day one. But the sooner you start getting the data out of your sites and looking at that data through the energy performance lens, the better, because where you've got to get to is using your own. Remember, I was talking about the central data set. You're a key consumer. You as a heat network operator are a key consumer of your own data to understand how your network is working. Take steps to ensure that it is performing in line with, for example, technical standards, which leads to acceptable pricing, which leads to decarbonization, et cetera. This is right at the heart of everything. So you are a consumer of that data. You need to be putting your own network right, and then making a submission to Ofgem and maybe others to show that the network is working well. So long before Ofgem require your data, you want to be consuming it yourself in order to make your networks better. You'll then want to go through that cycle of monitoring your own systems. So it's not just going to be a once a year somebody goes and pulls a bunch of data and spits it into Ofgem. If you're doing that, you're going to be in trouble, because we know that heat network performance drifts where they're not monitored, where no one's looking at that data and taking action. So one of the things that may happen in the future is digital platforms may proactively pull you in, you as the operator or your O&M provider, when the heat network is stepping out of line. The crucial thing here is I want to emphasize the importance of using your own energy performance data to make sure this is working well. And then there's the compliance piece. Then there's the submission to Ofgem. And that's just from a risk management point of view. That's the way it has to be done. Because imagine that you don't, right? Imagine that you just let the network performance drift, or maybe it wasn't such a good network in the first place. If it was unmonitored, it probably isn't. And you then make a submission to Ofgem, you get caught in the net, and now you have to go through the eye is on you, and you have to go through the process of whatever they require. Let's imagine it's a remediation plan that's then going to be checked over time. Much better to do it with plenty of time on your own terms in advance of your submission. Okay. So here is an example of, this is out of Pinpoint, so which I'll tell you about in a sec, but this is our visualization and analysis platform. The dashboards on the left are from two different blocks on the same heat network. And you can see that one of the blocks is actually doing quite well. It's a 6336, right? So mid-60s flow temp and sort of mid-30s return temp. Reasonably low heat loss per dwelling. It's 108. We'd like to see it lower. We'd like to see sub 100, somewhere between 75 is delightful. We'll see where the requirements are set. But then if you look at another block on that same scheme, you can see that the delta T, that's the speedometer right there in the middle of the bottom that bottom dashboard. It says 6.9 degrees C. So it's a really small delta T. Why is it small? Well, there's two main reasons, two broad categories. It's either the dwellings that are causing you problems, or it's bypasses being left open, or it's both. And in this case, it's both. How do we know it's both? Well, on that same dashboard at the bottom, can you see that percentage of bypass flow is 50%. So half of the water that's being pumped around that block is not coming back through an HIU. It's actually coming back through a bypass. Provided you've got your bulk meter and you've got all your endpoint meters, you can do the maths and work out what that otherwise invisible bypass flow is. And you got to go looking for that bypass, and you got to get it closed. That, getting, for anybody who's watched the heat network optimization videos or read the guide that was published afterwards, both of which are definitely worth your time. Getting your flow rates under control is your first job, right? So here you're looking at bypasses, and then on the right-hand side over here on block B, you can see the individual dwellings listed out, and the overall volume-weighted average return temps are way too high. Those are those first like 4 rows, 5 rows. So you've actually got some dwellings that are poorly committed. This is a brand new site, right? But they've not been properly commissioned. And the combination of those bypasses and the poorly performing HIUs tell you exactly what you're going to do when you're going to go in and get your flow rates under control and address the performance issues that you've got. The heat loss per dwelling on this is on the bottom dashboard on the bottom right. This is 153. So 50% more than the block on top. So you've got a whole lot of heat losses per dwelling in that second block as a result of this network not performing. And the consequence, and Ofgem knows this, the consequence is the price is going to be too high. The carbon emissions are going to be too high. We've almost certainly not met basic levels of technical standards, right? So that's a real easy catch if you're an Ofgem. Next, please. Okay, so this is your Pinpoint. This is our data visualization and analysis platform. So we pull real-time data from individual dwellings, block meters, plant room to give transparency to the operators and their consultants or their O&M providers. They can all see exactly how well the heat network is working. And when it's not working well, you can go to where the problem is so that you know where you're going to fix it, ideally what you're going to fix when you get there, and you can then verify that the situation is rectified when the engineers leave the site, right? So anybody who's operated a heat network for a little while knows that when you call somebody, or when your O&M company goes out reactively in response to a call out, very often they will leave the site with the network in a worse condition than when they arrived. Yep, they might have sorted out the perceived issue in flat 4, but the reality is now you've got a whole bunch of higher temperature water returning to the network, driving up your losses, your carbon emissions, your cost of heat, etc. So verifying that things have actually been put right in the data is totally necessary, and that's what we enable. This allows you to spot things like HIU faults, open bypasses, problems with commissioning, and then by making this data available, the idea is it's fewer callouts, it's first-time fixes, it's knowing exactly where to go instead of guessing. And then in doing that, you keep your operating costs low. Okay. So where might we look to understand the sort of data that Ofgem may require, right? So they haven't published the KPI list yet. So where can we look? Well, we can look at things like the GLA's be seen requirement. This is where there's a requirement on schemes that have been through the GLA approval to report for 5 years after the defects and liability period each year on how the system is performing relative to what was promised. right? So how did this used to work? This used to work where you just submitted an energy strategy as part of your planning permission, and then you built pretty much what was in the energy strategy, and then nobody ever talked about it again, right? And again and again, I know I made this point once before, but again and again, we've seen that where you don't check, if somebody just said, yeah, we'll definitely do that, those things do not perform well, right? But where you measure against the original requirements, then you got a chance. And GLA knows this too. That's what informs their be seen requirement. And that is a number of things they do. This also applies not just to heat networks, but to other things as well. Let me just, do I actually want to draw out your particular examples? Yeah, okay, fine. So things like contextual data and then energy use and renewable energy, which relates to carbon emissions. In energy use, then it's checking whether the overall levels of fuel consumption and output imply an efficiency in line with what was originally promised. So this idea of efficiency is key. This idea of testing whether or not the energy system is fulfilling what the spreadsheet says, what the energy strategy said at planning phase is crucial. It also covers things like energy storage and whether you're exporting from your system. So be seen as one source. Another source is, I'll just make this too small to read. Okay. Another source is HNES, right? So this is the current funding program for improving existing heat networks, where it's 100% funding for optimization studies and 50% funding for capital works. That's going on right now. And they, unsurprisingly, also have a set of metrics that a recipient needs to continue to report against for 24 months after all funding measures have been installed. So there are some words around here about as many as possible, but the kinds of things are what we're interested in, right? So we've got things like carbon emissions, fuel use, overall efficiency, distribution losses. That is a super important one. So this is quantifying the heat losses where you are distributing your heat, for example, in a block. But they want to break down by the primary, secondary, and tertiary, certainly primary and secondary, so outside the home. Watts per dwelling is a metric that you will see a lot more of in the future. This is where you're trying to normalize your metric so that you can compare between schemes. And one of the ways of doing that is watts per dwelling. So the overall losses, instantaneous losses from the system, divided by the number of dwellings. I already talked about that in relation to that tiny little case study we looked at earlier, where one of the blocks had 100 watts per dwelling and the other one had 150. That's an example of how that metric gets used and can be used to compare apples with apples when you've got different size blocks or networks. And then network flow and return temps, cost the operator, heat tariffs, etc. Heat tariffs is a really interesting one. We're not covering that on this webinar, but expect for tariffs to be reported to Ofgem and potentially Ofgem to then be publishing those. Outages and interruptions, etc. This is very similar to heat trust reporting as well, which is another example. And then the final one that I would cite would be the code of practice for heat networks. Now, CP1, as it's also called, has got a whole lot of metrics in it. Some of them I think are directly relevant. Some of them, it's a bit of a Venn diagram. A lot of what's in CP1 I would expect to form the basis of the KPIs that will eventually be required by Ofgem, and you're looking at some of those right here. Right? There's no surprise that they chose things like watts per dwelling, etc. So that's another set. They're all aligned, whether it's be seen or it's HNES or it's CP1, they're all aligned on this idea of collecting the data that's necessary to prove how the network is actually working key things to watch out for: heat loss, bypass flow, return temperature, including volume weighted average return temperature. These are fundamentally important metrics. Next one, please. Okay, cool.
Thank you, Casey. We have a few questions in.
Do you want me to mute and you can talk, or do you want to?
I'm going through.
You're going through me. Okay, fine.
It should be okay.
Okay.
I'll read the ones that have come out so far, but if you have any more questions, please feel free to submit. Okay, so first question: the complete management of district and communal heating networks sits across a number of various departments within a business.
Yeah.
Where does or should the responsibility for future reporting sit within those organizations?
Where should it sit? There's if you look in the consultation document, so right now there's a consultation out on the consumer protection part of regulation. A bunch of the other aspects, so remember that slide that kind of where Ofgem breaks down the different areas of their regulation. A bunch of the other areas are going to be consulted on in the first part of next year. That's the time frame that they've said, including things like technical standards and decarbonization and price and so on. So when this consultation document comes out, you get this chance to kind of you get a flavor of what they're thinking, because they declare what they're minded to do, and you get to do lots of reading between the lines as well to work it out. There is a concept of I think it's owner and operator, or operator and heat provider. They're breaking it down into a couple of pieces, but they recognize that actually it's almost always one organization, right? So one organization is the heat network operator and the heat provider on a heat network. They're the ones who have the responsibility for the part that they control. So I realize that you're asking about which part of the company should be, or which part of the organization should be responsible. Ofgem's not going to say which part of the organization should be responsible. They're just going to say, as a legal entity, you've got a responsibility as the operator or the heat provider to do this to achieve compliance. So there's an extra bit of nuance, I guess, here. And that comes back to my point about technical standards applying, or let's see, certification applying to different parts of a heat network, because they come in all different shapes and sizes, right? Some of them are just single building, multi-occupancy systems, pretty straightforward commercially. Some of the others are, you've got a big energy center somewhere. You've got one organization that's responsible for the transmission, or the large scale distribution around a city, and then you've got blocks or clusters of blocks that are then interfacing to that bit, and then they take responsibility, right? So there's going to have to be an allocation of responsibility to the organization that controls that part of the network. It's not going to be imagine you've got a citywide network with an operator of the energy center and the large scale distribution network. They're not also going to be responsible, presumably, this is what we think now, for the regulation of the on-site, the in-block portions of the network. So if you, as a legal entity, as an organization, are operating, say, a block or a network, then you as an organization are going to be responsible for that. They're not going to say imagine you're an HA, they're not going to say it's got to be the housing team, or it's got to be, I don't know, sustainability or whatever. They're not going to comment on that. They're just going to be looking at it from a legal point of view.
Okay, next question. We've got two more at the moment. First is, in order to operate the Guru Pinpoint system, what hardware needs to be installed? Does it require sign up to a subscription to access the data?
Okay, cool. So first of all, the data, if you're a heat network operator and you've got a contractual relationship with your residents, it's not Guru data. It is your data as an operator. we have recently been through a whole ground up redevelopment of Pinpoint that's just been released in the last couple of months. And when we did that, we developed the underlying data pipeline to accept data from non-Guru sites, right? So we're pulling in data now from other people's systems, might just be MBus data loggers, or could be other people's pay-as-you-go systems, or could just be something that's sent to us from the operator in the form of CSV files. There's a huge variation out there. But the way we view our job is we have to cope with that wide variety, do the QA, do the data transformation, and then get the best out of that data by putting the visualization and analysis in front of the operator. As a a purpose-driven but for-profit company, yeah, there's a subscription fee associated with that. We scale that, so even for small operators, they pay the same as for big operators. Everybody gets the benefit of scale. And when you compare the subscription prices against what that data then enables you to do as an operator, it's just, it's vanishingly small. So we're happy to talk in more detail if that's of interest to you. But the things I want you to take away are: one, it's your data. Two, you're going to have to be doing this visualization and analysis, not just from sites where Guru's installed, but for all the others as well. And that's what we're now tooled up to do. So all of that can flow through Guru's platforms and Pinpoint.
Two more questions. Next one, if we were exempt from heat metering on the last assessment, is it going to be a priority to get heat metering installed?
Yeah, okay, interesting. So you need to draw a line between the heat network regs and what's coming up from Ofgem, because the heat network regs are just a part of the picture. So for example, how might this play out? How might it be different in the future? Under the heat network regs, you got that spreadsheet, you did a viability test, and maybe the spreadsheet said you didn't need to install any meters. It is entirely possible that there will no longer be a viability test, right? There might just be exempt classes and COT classes and nothing else, in which case meters are going in. It's not just, so what I'm trying to communicate here is that it's not just the heat network regs being subsumed into Ofgem. This is Ofgem saying, right, clean slate, what are we going to require? Now the heat network regs are still there, but that doesn't mean that Ofgem just do that. They are, I believe, very likely to do two things differently than before. One of them is more metering. In discussions with them, the vibe is they just get that you have to have data in order to verify outcomes, or performance is likely to be poor, right? So they totally get that. And for that, in a way that in 2013, 2014 or whatever, when the regs were coming out, people didn't grasp yet. The other thing that I think they get is the need to enforce, right? What we saw with heat network regs was not a lot of enforcement. Everybody saw that. Ofgem, I think, get it, that you have to be seen to enforce your requirements. So put those two things together, and now metering is going in, and people are going to have to report, and then based on that reporting, we'll enforce. So I wouldn't just look at your last go, for example, your last submission to OPSS under the heat network regs as, okay, if we were okay there, we're okay now. No, that's not the case.
Last question. Where another entity owns the network and outsources the services to, say, an O&M provider, what do you consider will be responsible? Who do you consider will be responsible for reporting to Ofgem?
Okay. Okay, here's a guess, right? Just a guess, not legal advice. It will ultimately be the legal entity with responsibility for the provision of heat, operation of the network, provision of heat. The fact that you've outsourced something, and that you might even commercially or contractually lay off some of your risk, That's a legal or commercial issue. It's not compliant. Compliant is that Ofgem is going to be looking at you. That's my impression. That's what I believe is unfolding in front of us. Ofgem's going to be looking at you as the operator and heat provider to achieve compliance for the part of the system that you operate. Maybe you're just the site operator, you're a block operator, a cluster of blocks, and there's a wider transmission or distribution network around you. That's going to be somebody else's responsibility. But you as the heat provider or the network operator, even if you've outsourced portions of that responsibility to someone else, are still ultimately, in my view, going to have the liability, the responsibility for reporting to Ofgem.
Okay, we're done with questions and we're just on time.
Okay.